speaking of all these interviews that you've done, you interviewed people from over a dozen different countries and way more than that. Stars of all levels of stardom. I've seen you interview WrestleMania main eventers all the way down to indie names that are on the rise. It's been an absolute joy to see your catalog of interviews. It's inspiring, especially for a show like ours that's just starting up. I wanted to ask you, how do you prepare for these interviews, both, on a mental scale, just internally, and if you could share any tips and tricks, research or anything like that. What is your strategy to prepare for interviews on a short scale, short time frame, or if you have a longer time frame?
Yeah, so the entire idea of the kind of interviews that I do is I call them turnkey interviews. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do is I try to ask unconventional questions. I try to ask questions that haven't been asked of this wrestler, and questions that this wrestler might actually have fun discussing or be willing to share their perspective on them because of their experiences in the industry or just their life experiences on the whole. So like the basic thing, of course, would be to read/watch their previous interviews and like see what's the recurring questions that we are trying to avoid. But also another thing is whenever I interview wrestlers, the way I do it is I usually, when I inquire, I already know what's the main topic that I want to talk to the wrestler about. And that's like part of the reason why this interviews like happen on a seemingly weird, in a seemingly weird time frame, because I've inquired for interviews and I've had wrestlers ask me like, why didn't you ask me earlier? But I just feel the need to, as a creator, right, to understand what this wrestler stands for me to be able to bring it out and for the viewer to be able to also feel that, because I need to have a very, very clear idea of what this wrestler is about to be able to ask the right questions. And my goal is when you click on the interview, even if you see this wrestler for the first time in your entire life, I want you to still be compelled to watch it, and I want you to still be entertained, and I want you to learn something. And sometimes that thing that I single out, sometimes I'm wrong about it. Sometimes I think we're going to go off talking about, say, a heel presentation in cinematic promos, but then it turns out this person just so happens to like rescue animals and love dogs and devote all of their free time to that. So we'll just dive into that. And it's just my idea and my concept is wrestlers are humans, obviously, newsflash, and they are way bigger than their persona, and they are way bigger than a worker, and they all have their peculiarities, and those peculiarities shape them as a worker as well. And that's why I feel the need to unpack them and to tackle them. I also always tell wrestlers before we start rolling that as a journalist, my job is to ask the hard questions. But if you don't want to answer, that's perfectly fine. And they're free to always tell me that they don't want to say something that is no comment, and I will cut it, no questions asked. I've had that happen. And I do mention it when I give you interviews, because people have tried to hold it against me because I have an interview with Sean Dean, who is a veteran who was in the army, and we talked about the gendered injustices in the army, and we talked about the issue of sexual assault in the army, and that video got a lot of clicks, partially because of those difficult topics. And some of the comments were like, oh my God, he looks so uncomfortable. I bet he hated it. I bet he would never even talk to you again. Literally, I left the set after the interview, and on Twitter, it's public. You can go look it up. He mentioned me and he went oh, thank you for the interview. This was a great experience. And I could tell that he, liked talking about it in a way that it's more insightful, it's more important, I guess I could say, because he's also very much an advocate for a lot of initiatives that have to do with Army veterans. He brought in several foundations, several charities that AEW has worked with in terms of helping veterans, helping people who suffer from PTSD, helping people with disabilities and stuff like that. So he also like genuinely believes in the cause. So it's my pleasure to give him a platform.
Absolutely. Abso-friggin-lutely. That's one of the things that I think some people tend to forget, is that it's not just a matter of turn on a microphone and stick them with something and hope that whatever. It's more than that. And that I'm very glad that you mentioned that example specifically, because that is something that I feel you might get unfair and fairly on the surface level. Just people will look at something and imagine some idea of what happened. They'll see something and they'll figure what is going on. Do you figure that happens a lot, where if it's an uncomfortable topic or an uncomfortable situation, that because you said you ask difficult questions, you're obviously only going to include ones that are consensual and ones that are agreed upon. But is it something that you find almost detrimental, or have you ever felt the desire to shrink away from that? Or is that only empowered you to ask difficult questions? These people that seem to create the narrative in their heads or spread it that it's a problem, or that you shouldn't ask these questions, or that, so such and such has this expression, or they don't seem to want to answer it, therefore it's a problem, when clearly it isn't. And you know better, but they seem to not.
Yeah. I've never had an impulse to pull away from that, really. I wouldn't say so. And when I say ask hard questions, they're hard for the wrestler, they're hard for the viewer to hear, but they're also hard for me, because a lot of the times, especially, I'm very openly a feminist. I advocate for exposure for women in the industry. And there's some topics like that I'm very familiar with, because it's something that I've also experienced. But when I go into the interview and I'm trying to talk to a wrestler about a hardship that they've experienced that I have no experience with whatsoever, that's when I'm nervous. That's when I'm trying to be very, very respectful, very, very careful. Say, when I was interviewing, some wrestlers of different cultural backgrounds, I don't know what they've experienced, and I need to be respectful of it, and I need to let them speak on their terms. Or when I've interviewed, say, Dark Sheik, who's transgender, and I have no experience with that, but I wanted to talk to her about her experience in the industry as a transgender woman, and how she overcame some difficulties that came with it, because I feel like it's important to talk about it. But as a cis woman who has no experience and who doesn't know what it's like, I had to be really careful with the way that I formulated the questions and with the way that I approached it. I feel like, the answer is pretty much being respectful, being careful, being very open, communicative with the talent, and, seeing what works and what doesn't. And also, another thing is social media. It's always going to be very touchy. Topics like that are always going to be very acute. And you cannot blame people for that, because they are touchy and they are acute. And people live their lives like that, and people want to be represented in a way that's respectful and that's accurate. And I cannot say I'm perfect. I've had my moments. I've definitely been canceled on Twitter a couple of times, and it's definitely made me learn some things the hard way. And I wouldn't have it any other way, because I wouldn't want my followers to just let it slide. I wouldn't want my followers to protect me regardless of what I say. If there's something off, I want to be educated, and I want to be open, and I want to listen, because as an interviewer, that's all I strive to do. I have to be able to approach a huge array of different topics with respect and to be informed. It's another thing when people start being aggressive about it, which again sometimes is justified because they're hurt, because aggression comes from hurt, and I hurt those people, so it's only logical that they're aggressive. But a lot of the times it's hard to discern whether a person is trying to help or whether they're just jumping on the bandwagon because they didn't like you from the start and they're just finally allowed to be an asshole to you. When that also happens, they're like, oh, it's finally a socially acceptable opportunity to call her the B word. But yeah, it's something that's definitely a little harder to navigate than if I were just asking them like, oh, what's your favorite match? What's your dream opponent? It's definitely comes with its complexities, but it's definitely still not something that I would want to step away from.
And for me, I've been in wrestling for 15 years, going on 16. So I've found I get most invested in wrestlers when I hear them talk about topics that have nothing to do with wrestling, and I can share that commonality. Like when I didn't know Ricky Shane Page outside of my buddy who does death matches with him. When I found how into pop punk he is, I'm like, yeah. and so then just talk to Ricky Shane Page about pop punk music, and now I root for him heavily on everything he does. And I think a lot of fans can relate to that, because there's so much of these same styles of wrestling all the time. Characters don't get presented as much as they used to. And they don't have time to develop characters as much as they used to. So I think bringing out those characteristics of the human behind the character is a huge deal, and not something that a lot of wrestling interviewers do. It's, again, who was your favorite opponent? When did you do this? So I really enjoy that you take on that and get to know the person behind the character. And you said people talking about Sean Dean, like he looked uncomfortable. Like I think they appreciate it too. I've known Sean's a Chicago guy, so I've known him before he went to train with AR Fox. He still owes me a rematch for that title. But he's a sweetheart of a guy who loves talking about these types of things. The reason he looked awkward was he doesn't talk about them often. So it was something that you don't get to see his look when he talks about this. So he's introspective, he's thinking, and he's looking. Well, that's not how you usually see him. So it just comes off different. And I think, to your applaud, that's wonderful.
Actually, as an interviewer, the best thing a talent can tell me is no one has ever asked me this question before. Or thank you for asking me. I wanted to talk about it. Like when I hear those phrases, like I know I did my job well.
Yeah,
because I'm sorry, Viv, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's all right. Go ahead.
No, I said go ahead.
Oh, jeez. Definitely gonna edit this part out.
It's a good thing it's gonna be edited.
Yeah. This is never gonna be live.
That was one of your first questions. One of your first questions was, "Is this gonna be live?" I was like, "Dude, no." And you and I were both like, "Oh, thank God! Like, we cannot do live. Not gonna happen."
I'm doing live stuff when I'm the guest, but I don't think I could do live
when it's someone else's problem. Sure,
I'm just gonna show up.
when the burden of the flow is.
I'm way too much of a goofball and a doofus to do things completely live unless it's like in front of a crowd. But otherwise.
Yeah.
So you step on each other, for instance. Sorry, Viv, again. You step on each other so much during I'm done. All right, Viv, you.
The worst part is that you're sitting here thinking, like, is what you're saying even worth, like, being like, oh, no, I know what I was going to say is definitely not worth it. Jeez.
It takes, like, mental strength to be like, yes, what I have to say is more important.
Right.
Exactly. Let's all take a drink break. We've been talking for a while.